United States, we're immersed in capitalism's socio-cultural matrix. It structures our access to needs and wants. Its institutions mediate our every social interaction. And through its narratives, its mythical narratives, it instills in us its language and logic, and in so doing ultimately conditions our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. It's relatively easy to see how a system which structures our access to life's basic necessities could wield so much influence over our social structures, but how is it able to get into our heads? How is capitalism able to become a ubiquitous fixture in our culture? It accomplishes this task with its most powerful tool, and arguably our most pervasive cultural myth, the American dream. It is through the dream that capitalism surreptitiously gains entry into our hearts and minds, instilling in us the necessary customs, values, and conceptual language required to ensure its continual reproduction, both within our individual identities and within its institutions, which we perpetuate every day when we perform capitalism. It's no coincidence, then, that values central to capitalism's proper functioning, such as individualism, competition, hard work, and the desire for upward mobility, should feature so prominently in the dream narrative. It is, after all, this language and these values, which is at the core of why capitalism is so effective at what it does. These values, however, do not stand alone in the dream narrative. Instead, they are closely coupled with and related to a separate set of even more fundamental values. Values such as freedom, equality, liberty, and justice. Values which constitute the very logic upon which those secondary values mentioned earlier rely. And values which are so deeply ingrained in us that they take on an air of self-evidence. And it is this ubiquity, this self-evidence, this fundamentality, which has enabled the American dream to act as and to become our mythical backdrop and our collective cultural foreground, that thing from and against which capitalism can assert itself, structurally, symbolically, and subjectively. For many lower-income Americans, capitalist institutions and culture have allowed for and even justified egregious forms of exploitation, the worst of which, those involving employers failing to follow even the most basic state and federal wage and hour laws, are often collectively referred to as wage theft, and include such practices as paying workers less than the minimum wage, misclassifying workers as independent contractors, thereby placing a greater tax burden on them, tip stealing, and worst of all, refusing to pay workers anything whatsoever. This type of exploitation is probably much more widespread than one might think. In fact, studies by the National Employment Law Project have shown that as many as 2 out of every 3 low-wage workers suffer some form of wage theft every week. Although there are laws against this type of exploitation, they're poorly enforced by an overworked and understaffed Department of Labor, representing a legal system which privileges the rights of businesses over those of workers. In a culture which lionizes small business owners and looks up to CEOs as paragons of American achievement, while simultaneously blaming poverty on the poor, assuming them to be too lazy to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Understanding the world in such a way becomes all too easy for us to view even law-breaking employers simply as individuals pursuing their own American dreams, and ultimately, therefore, as examples of our collective ideal. It's not difficult, then, to see how wage theft is in many ways legitimated and even justified by our most powerful social structures and cultural narratives. What then are we to make of those who fight against it? How, in spite of this profoundly capitalist socio-cultural foregrounding, do certain individuals become involved with social movement organizations which challenge the status quo, which fight against worker exploitation, and which in many ways seek to undermine capitalism's institutional hegemony, and more importantly, which offer radically disparate interpretations of its most cherished and powerful cultural narratives? My research begins by exploring this question at an organizational or institutional level, by analyzing the collective action framing activities of Workers' Justice United, a social movement organization dedicated to fighting wage theft in a large southern city. In general, we can think of frames as interpretive lenses, offered by social movements to help potential supporters see situations in a particular way. Sociologists William Gampson and Charlotte Ryan claim, quote, "A frame is a thought organizer, highlighting certain events and facts as important, while rendering others invisible. Like a picture frame, an issue frame marks off some part of the world. Like a building frame, it holds things together. It provides coherence to an array of symbols, images, and arguments, lining them through an underlying, organizing idea that suggests what is essential and what consequences and values are at stake. Likewise, social movement scholars David Snow and Robert Binford lay out several core framing tasks, which all collective action frames must attempt to accomplish, such as helping to define a problem, pointing to who or what is to blame, offering a solution, and calling potential supporters to action. Utilizing ethnography and content analysis, I have outlined WJU's primary collective action frame as one of faith and justice. Unlike much other social movement scholarship, I'm not so much interested in the functions collective action frames play, as in the relationship between collective action frames and culture, especially cultural narratives. Past scholarship on this subject has explored this relationship in two primary fashions. First, by looking at the ways in which social movements have used culture as a toolkit and as a source of legitimacy, and second, by describing the ways in which cultural legitimacy is inherently limited and limiting to social movements. Although I acknowledge the reality of both of these trends, I tend towards the first, and ultimately, my work attempts to explore this dialectic relationship between social movement frames and culture. I argue that as an interfaith organization, WJU and its frames draw on the conceptual language and social networks of various religious groups as sources of legitimacy and material and symbolic support. Even more central to WJU's frames, however, than religious imagery, is the language and logic of the American dream. Many of WJU's framing activities involve stories about hard-working employees who just want to support themselves and their families, but are unable to do so because greedy employers are stealing their wages. These stories, which so clearly appeal to the structure and values of the American dream, sit alongside secondary framing language, which situates them in the explicit language of faith and justice. Framing, however, is by no means a one-way process, whereby social movement organizations simply draw on culture for support and legitimation. Instead, it is an active, interpretive process, a form of meaning-making and of reality construction. There's a lot of ideas present in the American dream, and many of them contradict one another in different circumstances. If we think back to Gamson and Ryan's definition of framing, we can see that frames are interpretive contextualizers. They highlight some facts and make others invisible, marking off parts of the world and breaking it up into pieces, and then reconstructing those pieces. WJU's framing does just this to the American dream, by elevating certain concepts such as freedom and justice, while ignoring others like competition and individualism. The dialectic nature of frames extends even further than this, however, as frames not only interpret culture, but are in dialogue with societal interpretations of its narratives. Social movement frames can only derive legitimacy from culture within real, if somewhat ambiguously defined, thresholds of acceptability. In order for the claims made by frames to be intelligible, and to elicit affective emotions in supporters, they must at some level jive with socially accepted interpretations of the cultural narratives from which they seek to draw legitimacy. On the other hand, if social movement interpretive frames which push the envelope, become widely accepted enough and resonate with enough people, they can actually alter those thresholds of acceptability and not only create meaning, but actually shift broad cultural understandings. Until now, individuals have largely been absent from this discussion. Yet social movement organizations are, after all, made up of people, and the collective action frames that they construct are generated in the interactions among individual activists. Let us then add one more voice to this dialectic meaning-making conversation, that of subjective experience. The way in which we understand the world around us, including such constructs as wage theft and the American dream, is shaped by a myriad of sources, each bouncing interpretations back and forth. Informed by a series of in-depth interviews with WJU supporters, my research demonstrates that the ways in which activists discuss issues such as exploitation, wage theft, fairness, justice, and the American dream are all conditioned by societal interpretations of cultural narratives. Yet they are mediated also by organizational and collective action frames, and by personal experiences with things such as exploitation, other forms of activism, and religious identity. Each of these forces is mediated by the others, meaning that there's no clear and unbroken path. in which a collective action frame simply tells a person precisely how to act or how to view the world. Rather, the messages given by frames are mediated by subjective experience and conditioned by personal background and societal interpretive thresholds. There's really not any way for me to make this entirely clear, so let me just give an example. WJU supporter Mitch Throm works at his union's local office. He's a leader among his fellow workers. Having experienced exploitation firsthand, he understands the true value of the organization for which he works, the support and protection that it can bring him. But what you must understand about Mitch is that aside from his work and his family, his life is centered around a personal relationship with God and strong ties to his faith community. Mitch was raised in an extremely conservative Southern Baptist church, and although his father was a union member, he never really discussed the matter. So the messages Mitch heard from his community and from the authority figures within it were ones which demonized liberal politics, and which spoke of union members as communists and tree huggers. Even today, it's impossible for Mitch to fully reconcile his lived experience, i.e., that unions protect him in his daily life, with his religious background and his faith community, which denies him the validity of this experience. He feels that he must keep his union membership, and with it a large part of his life, hidden and secret from his faith community. However, upon becoming involved with WJU, for the first time in his life, Mitch heard religious figures preaching workers' justice and praising unions, and doing so in an explicitly religious language. Mitch's motivation was not simply handed to him by some frame. Rather, it developed from the culmination of many sources. His understanding of things such as hard work and justice was mediated not only through WJU's frames and his personal experiences, but even through those conservative interpretive thresholds set by his faith community. Mitch's story shows us that meaning and motivation are incredibly complex, but it also tells us something very valuable about the American dream. Simply think of all of the interpretive shifts the dream underwent in the dialectic process of Mitch's ontological development. In attempting to understand WJU's supporters' interpretive meaning-making processes, it has also been my aim to make manifest the perpetually contested nature of the American dream as a cultural narrative, and to contribute to larger discussions around its meaning and function within society. We as sociologists often look on the American dream through an entirely negative lens. Empirically, we know the dream to be a falsity, and that the achievement of upward mobility, which it promises, is hindered by all manner of social and cultural and structural barriers. We look on the dream negatively also in the central role it plays in facilitating the myth of meritocracy, which causes so much damage to so many people, giving rise to everything from colorblind racism to welfare reform to the current state of our prisons and schools. So let me be very clear. The negativity with which we view the dream is entirely and absolutely justified, but it's not the whole picture. The dream is neither good nor evil. It just is. Regardless of its consequences, it forms our mythical backdrop and cultural foreground, existing both out there in structures and culture and in here, both living in and speaking through each of us, conditioned by the organizations and the institutions in which we're situated, and colored by our subjective experiences. Ultimately, the dream both arises from and acts as our cultural foreground and the interpretive lens through which we understand the world and enact our place within it. And because it is embedded deeply within us, inevitably it finds its way into every facet of our lives, from the ways in which we run our businesses to the ways in which we organize and attempt to build support for our social movements, giving the dream, therefore, the paradoxical power to offer no more and no less cultural support to the business owner who steals his employees' wages than to the social movement activist engaged in the fight against that exploitation. Thank you very much.